In the larger garages, the man who becomes expert in servicing engines may find specialized work on engines only. Regular training conferences are held for employees in the more up-to-date garages. The manager discusses the newest automobile developments and how to service them properly. Movies and slide films are sometimes shown in the local shops.
There's a motif in the memoir that's introduced in the preface, with Marvin Fenn's question about which mechanic Forrest would prefer to work on his car. The question gives you a choice of mechanics, one with an academic knowledge of cars, but no real-world experience, and one with lots of experience but no degree. Marvin Fenn, TCU grad with a master's in education, math teacher, school principal, apparently had come to terms. And it's a beautiful thing. No wonder Forrest can still recall this moment in the distant past. Marvin knew his son, understood who he was, and he said, "You're good the way you are." And coming from him, a man who spent his whole life educating, it's really amazing. He said, "It's okay if school isn't your thing. There's a place for you in this world. You'll do fine." Today I want to look at the Santa Fe chapters in the memoir. I'm referring to the 4 chapters between My War for Me and Flywater. This section covers the longest period of time, but it's the shortest of the 4 sections that are married to a setting, an important place. The first box here covers growing up in Texas. Then it's Yellowstone stories. Then it's a chapter that centers around Vietnam. Then it's the Santa Fe chapters. There's almost an inverse relationship between the amount of years covered and the amount of space devoted to that period in the book. After this section, the book changes. There's Texas, Yellowstone, Vietnam, Santa Fe. In Flywater, we sort of get in a helicopter and hover above the geography. The book's stories are no longer about specific places anymore. Flywater, more than anything, is a mood piece. If we're pressed to link this chapter to a place, it's obviously Yellowstone. The introduction specifically mentions Yellowstone, and he refers several times to places up north. You can fly fish in any of the 4 search states, but when he published this before the memoir in 2008, he didn't send the article to a local paper in New Mexico. He sent it up to Montana. For his memoir, Forrest removed the specific reference to the fire hole and didn't put it with the other Yellowstone chapters. It's here because it can't really go after the treasure hunt is launched in Golden Moor, but it doesn't belong with anything that has come previously because it's the perspective of someone older, someone who has faced their own mortality. So, this is the Santa Fe section. Now, there was a chapter in Forrest's life, figuratively speaking, after leaving the Air Force, before the Fenns arrived in Santa Fe. You may have heard his story about throwing his watch into a cotton field somewhere between Reese Air Force Base and his home in Lubbock. The best part about that story is imagining Forrest driving a tiny VW Bug. There are 6 newspaper articles that mention Forrest during his Lubbock years. And if you're interested in getting to know amateur archaeologist Forrest Fenn during this part of his life, I highly recommend the tape recordings available at Texas Tech's Vietnam Center and the Sam Johnson Vietnam Archive.
Although a number of artifacts have been picked up out there, and some excavated out of the caves that were substantially gone now.
So, Forrest was offered a promotion to lieutenant colonel, but he had already found his exit door. He was operating a foundry out of his garage at night. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the original Fenn Foundry.
In the Air Force, while I was working 8 or 10 hours a day, I made $80,000 in my garage after work, casting bronzes. I learned how to do that.
And that door right there is where Forrest greeted Peggy on Christmas Eve, 1968. Can you imagine that reunion after she had received a telegram saying her husband had been shot down and no parachute had been seen? So he turned down the promotion. He didn't want to sit in meetings all day and wear a Class A uniform. He bought a partnership in Rex Aerosmith's business for $25,000 in cash, plus the casting fees from 800 bronzes, which equaled the remaining $100K that he needed. The first chapter in this section is Blue Jeans and Hush Puppies Again, a title that dovetails nicely with Forrest's expressed disinterest in wearing a necktie and a polyester suit day in and day out. He and Peggy decided to make a go at it in Santa Fe. The culture suited them. It seemed laid back enough. But he was ready to work. Apparently he didn't want to cast bronzes for a living because he was making good money doing that. I think the again in the title refers to civilian life. That's what he says in the first sentence. This chapter is about the character-building lessons of defeat, which is another way of saying lessons learned the hard way, the school of hard knocks. However, it's really just one lesson involving one painting. And what strikes a reader right away is that Forrest goes straight to summarizing statements. In narratives, this is sometimes called telescoping. I find this really strange. He's starting this new adventure. It's a chance to slow down the pace of the storytelling, talk about the move, new schools for the kids. They have to find a place to live. Maybe he knows a couple of people, but everything is new. What are his impressions of this new city? We move past all of that. He's going to make such a big splash later on. You would think that he'd camp here just a little bit and set the mood. But Forrest, who is a great storyteller, takes a pass. He seems to be in a hurry to get through the material, and I don't know why. He does very briefly tell the story of the Gilbert Gould painting, and you can learn more about this particular work if you check out this AGK video that I have linked under a playlist heading for the artist. So we quickly come to Teachers with Ropes, the centerpiece of the Santa Fe stories. And the first sentence puts us in familiar territory. As in the last chapter, Forrest, by his own admission, is inexperienced. So there's continuity between Blue Jeans and Teachers with Ropes. And it's not surprising to see the word teachers in the title. Forrest needs to learn. Here come some teachers. In Blue Jeans, the teacher was experience, or actually failure, a lesson early on that cost them several $1,000s. Now we open this chapter. He tells the story of browsing other galleries to see what they were doing that might work for them. That is, imitation. He's going to borrow ideas from experienced gallery owners. Egos. The sense is that he's going to mold his own business after successful existing models. But you know the story. He walks in and immediately doesn't like what they're doing. Forrest Fenn is not a submissive student. He's got his own ideas. This other gallery only provides an example of what not to do. The egos are wrong. Apparently he doesn't want people in his gallery feeling the way he felt strolling through this other property. You turn the page and realize that unlike the previous chapter, our storyteller wants us to sit for a while. The narrative slows and we're not covering months or years in single sentences. We're lingering on a couple of episodes in Fenn galleries. By the way, if you've never seen inside Fenn galleries, the best pictures I've come across are in Texas Monthly from 1978. The chapter is called Teachers with Ropes, and this chapter has 2 anecdotes involving such. If you Google Santa Fe in the 70s, there's a mention of school visits to galleries. These outings must have been a fairly regular occurrence. Here we have our 2 stories, with school teachers and their line of students walking into Fenn galleries. The teachers eventually leave the room, and Forrest seems as happy to see them go as the students. Your mind immediately goes to the early chapters in the memoir when a young Forrest found school oppressive. And even now, at age 45 or so, Forrest has no intention of minding them. The teachers parrot the line from the egos, the experienced gallery owners, underscored by the red ink. So functionally in this narrative, they're stand-ins for the egos, representing the same kind of oppressive authority figure with senseless rules that squelch creativity and childlike passion. The first group gets to touch the cold bronze Indian head, which probably doesn't bother readers. But turn the page, deep breath. Now we're talking an original Gilbert Stuart priced at $150,000. Here's a newspaper article out of Colorado Springs that says Fenn Galleries displayed this work as part of a bicentennial exhibit in 1976. At first I worried that I had discovered proof that the kids touched that painting too much because Washington's mouth is almost gone. But that's just the poor print quality of newspapers from this era. Does Forrest choose the touch philosophy because it's good business? No. This doesn't help business at all, and it could potentially hurt it. His philosophy is born of convictions that supersede the teacher's expectations. Earlier, there was no explanation given for why Forrest thought the egos were wrong at the beginning of the chapter. But here he offers a rather thorough rationale for his do-touch philosophy. Isn't that surprising? Those teachers had training, certification, and experience. But Forrest also has a philosophy of pedagogy grounded in a need for experiential learning, tactile involvement, and one that accounts for students' individual perspectives. Whole books have been written about this approach. There are educational reform movements grounded in these ideas. He continues on page 113, but now it's about art. He says it's not meant to be worshipped, but treated like a friend. Yet in most situations, the art is behind glass, and that separation is too impersonal. He closes the chapter with an anecdote where a former student approaches him on the plaza. He's strolling around, eating an ice cream, and a woman says, "Remember me? I touched George Washington." In the very last chapter of the memoir, we have a mirror anecdote involving a bona fide teacher, Forrest's father, being approached in the same way. "Remember me? You disciplined me in junior high." Forrest takes the mantle of teacher. He actually takes over the class. He rejects the standard teaching methodology and offers a substitute. At the end of the chapter, there's a confrontation between the two parties. Remember the teacher with the PhD? She's a stand-in for the egos, the experienced gallery owners. They all have the same do-not-touch approach. The PhD says, "You were wrong." But the student says, "You made an impression." Forrest concludes, "I was right." Now we come to Tea with Olga. There's a lot of micro-level analysis, but we're just flying over the landscape here so we can pick up broad themes and ideas. First sentence, Forrest is back to the idea of learning lessons. It's becoming quite obvious what binds these chapters together. You're familiar with the story. It's a nice little 3-act play. Act 1, Forrest wants Olga's space to expand his gallery. She refuses. Act 2, Olga, now dying of cancer, agrees to Forrest's request with one favor. And Act 3, Olga dies, and Forrest acquires her casita and scatters her ashes. 3 acts might be enough to explain what's going on with the tea colors. I'm a little skeptical about the idea of Forrest hiding anything of value in these 3 teas. I think it was deliberate, and I think there's symbolism here, but we don't have to look at Pendleton blankets from Yellowstone in the 30s or one of the half-dozen flags that fit the color scheme. He's doing what writers do, and he saw it, by the way, in the classics he read in important literature, notably Gatsby. It could simply be that Forrest's failed attempts at doing what is right for his business left him in the red. Or, better yet, the red could be embarrassment that Olga saw right through his, quote, generosity. The black is when the deal is struck, Olga's last dying wish as her body succumbs to the disease. And the green, well, that's just a beautiful choice for Olga's reunion with her father on Taos Mountain. And it signifies the expansion of Fenn Galleries, which meant a greater capacity for revenue. The last sentence in the chapter takes us back to the first, and we are left to wonder exactly what was meant by "my cost could show a profit." I think it might have a dual meaning. On the surface, it refers to his business and the profitability of expansion, but I think it also speaks to something deeper. Olga was gone, but Forrest kept his word. The attorney she hired would have only been concerned with the real estate transaction in her will, What Forrest does with her remains is about loyalty and honor. It's an interesting chapter that foreshadows Forrest's own cancer diagnosis and his thoughts about what will happen after he's gone. Thus, so far, it's blue jeans, learned a lesson when we bought a painting we shouldn't have. Teachers, learned a lesson when we visited a gallery we didn't want to emulate. And tea with Olga, learned a lesson about investing in friendship. Plus, our most important chapter has another element. The student quickly became the teacher. The somber tone of Tea with Olga ties in perfectly with an odd little chapter that caps off our Santa Fe section. The story of Fenn Galleries is a success story. No doubt it was hard work, but it was a huge success. Yet this little incident with Marvin checking the books and seeing how lucrative his son's gallery was is played in a minor key. Listen to Forrest describe it. It was a melancholy recollection that suddenly made me feel totally inadequate. When he said he was proud of me, it didn't seem to help. He had a master's degree in education and had spent his adult life teaching children, and all I had was a knack for taking care of myself and my family. That still bothers me. This is startling, but it ties in with something that was stated earlier. There's a chord progression in music where a section in a minor key ends with a major chord, creating resolution and something uplifting. It's called the Picardy Third, and there are lots of examples. Listen to the end of the Beatles' And I Love Her, and you hear it. But you don't do the opposite. You don't end a song in a major key on a minor chord. That doesn't make sense to our brains musically. And this ending here doesn't make sense to the narrative. I suppose he kind of saves the story by adding on the part about his parents paying off their mortgage. Maybe that's our Picardy Third. But the point is the same about the melancholy of this little vignette. In the Santa Fe section, with its emphasis on learning, we have the reverberations of a motif that was established elsewhere in the book, going all the way back to the preface. The seed is planted with Marvin Fenn's rhetorical question to Forrest about which mechanic he wanted to work on his car. The motif is fleshed out in Jump-Starting the Learning Curve. Forrest really plants his flag here. The principal, who is also the problem child's father, asks, "Okay, son, what have we learned from all this?" And though Forrest doesn't understand at first, his father enlightens him. Forrest says the lesson was profound. Those 5 minutes were better than all the diplomas in Texas. He elaborates, "I prayed for D's, but no one listened. So I decided to do things my own way, and to heck with what people thought. I figured my failing classroom grades were more than offset by my valedictorian marks in Savvy 101 and Street Smarts 102. If you focus too much on little Forrest ducking out of Spanish class, you'll miss the fact that he has chosen to enroll as a student, just not the curriculum being offered. He's not interested in formal education, but he's learning. He makes marbles and yo-yos in Spanish class. He's a factory owner." The chapter Looking for Lewis and Clark explores this same motif of practical wisdom earned through trial and error. It also gives us one of the funniest moments in the whole book. 16-year-old Forrest and Donnie head out on a great adventure, and on the first night, they can't build a fire, they're almost out of matches, they use their one map for kindling, their horses wander off, and they eat all their rations. And they're as happy as can be. And when you get to the end of the chapter, he has a list of lessons learned. This habit of Forrest's makes me smile. He wrote down lessons for himself. Out of a specific life incident, he would lift the universal principle and memorialize it in a saying that he would commit to memory. You get a glimpse of that in this chapter. Here are the distillations of hard-earned wisdom. He said when he sold his business, he had 109 of these rules. He would revisit this list on the first of every month and move them around in order of importance. So, back to the Santa Fe chapters, especially Teachers with Ropes, the centerpiece, the heart of this section. If all you had was this one chapter, you'd still have a real good window into Forrest's mind and what drives him. It's all here. The iconoclasm, questioning authority, trusting intuition, learning by experience, and a disdain for pretense. This section is vitally connected to the early chapters, beginning in the preface. The seeds are in those chapters, especially jump-starting the learning curve. Teachers with Ropes is umbilically connected to that chapter. Here are all those early ideas come to fruition. The preface, learning curve, toy factory, Lewis and Clark, the kernels of thought in these early chapters spring to life in Teachers with Ropes. Even a chapter like Borderline Biddies, a lot of people say it's strange and it doesn't belong, but in fact it also touches on this motif. Forrest's rejection of the notion that youth shouldn't be wasted on the young is our motif in nascent form. Forrest stands in a long tradition of people who have said experience is key, rather than tradition or dogma or the dictates of authorities. And what Forrest accomplished in Santa Fe, living by these principles, is a tremendous advertisement for this philosophy. It's just not explored at great length here. Imagine for a moment being a Santa Fean who knew the Fenn family. You hear Forrest is writing a memoir, you're excited to buy your copy, you dive right in, and I think your reaction would be, what did I just read? Now, if I could travel back in time, I could comfort this hypothetical reader and just tell them to wait 3 years, because Forrest will publish another memoir that devotes about 150 pages to Santa Fe stories. But in the moment, in 2010, our reader is baffled, because in the thrill of the chase, you only get a few pages of short anecdotes, and honestly, probably not the ones you would have chosen. And surprisingly, not the ones Forrest frequently talked about in interviews after the memoir came out. Isn't that odd? He had the stories, he just decided not to use them. So I'm left wondering, why so little? Why these stories? And why the melancholy tone? Outside of Teachers with Ropes, you have an unsellable dead dog painting, a deceased neighbor, and a despondent father. Now, if you're a poker player, you can't help but think that this is a classic case of concealing your hand. If the treasure is in New Mexico, you quickly move through this section. This might explain the telescoping and the scarcity of material. Looking at Too Far to Walk and hearing Forrest in interviews, you certainly can't conclude that New Mexico is unimportant to him or that he hasn't enjoyed life in Santa Fe. But if all you have is these 4 chapters, and indeed this is all we have in this memoir, what kind of picture have you painted, and why? I'd like to think it goes beyond the unique publishing schedule, with the constraints of a man needing to duck out into the mountains and hide treasure and coordinate that perfectly with the release of the book. Kind of unique for printers. But it might be behind this. Or maybe Forrest didn't want to use up his good stories. He wanted to keep his best stuff in his back pocket for that gossip book he was working on. Some of these ideas are so pedestrian I hesitate to really consider them as valid. Maybe we should believe Forrest when he says that Fenn Galleries was just business. In our section here in Teachers with Ropes, he says he was glad when the school groups arrived because it got him away from the tedium of his desk. Most days he wasn't hobnobbing with celebrities. Most days he was doing unglamorous desk work. In Too Far to Walk, he fills in gaps, but he doesn't really say much about daily life as a gallery owner. It's mainly about the people he was fond of, and a couple of alligators. The chapter in Too Far to Walk that centers around the gallery the most is, ironically, about the fakes he bought. He said he's not an art lover. He's been asked if he misses the gallery days, and he's always said he only misses one thing: the thrill of finding a great painting. Not so he can keep it, but so he can turn a profit. So maybe he was glad to retire so he could do full-time what he always cared about. His true love, his true obsession, Indian artifacts and the people and history surrounding them. He devotes whole books to some of those things. If this is the case, then this slide needs to be corrected. This section, in our author's mind, was just the gallery years. It's still a fast pace for storytelling, but maybe that hints at how those years were marked by stress, the tedium of paperwork, payroll, schedules, endless streams of tourists coming through your front door. Maybe it wasn't as glamorous as we think. I hope I've given you some things to think about. I look forward to interacting with you and learning from you in the comments. Take care.